Story 1: Shadows Among the Pines. I remember the road clearly, though I've tried to forget most of that night. It was late autumn, and the Blue Ridge was already swallowing the sun, leaving long shadows stretching across the narrow, uneven back road I was following. The asphalt was cracked, grass clawing up through the fissures, and the trees leaned close, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky like gnarled fingers. I'd been driving for hours, hoping to reach a small cabin a friend had mentioned, but the directions had been vague, and cell service had already vanished miles back. That's when I first saw them. At first, I thought it might be deer, or some trick of the light. But the movement was too deliberate. Figures slipped between the pines, too upright to be animals, but their gait was off, jerky and unsettling. I slowed my truck, heart hammering in my chest. The closest figure paused, crouched low, and I saw a face streaked with mud, hair matted and wild, eyes reflecting a strange, unreadable awareness. They didn't run, didn't make a sound, just watched, as if trying to decide whether I belonged there or not. I blinked, and suddenly they melted into the shadows again, leaving me frozen in the middle of the road, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept driving, slower now, every sense straining. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jerk the steering wheel, half expecting them to leap out. By the time night fell, I knew I needed to stop. I found a small clearing farther down the ridge and set up my tent under a cluster of trees. I thought I might be safe there, but the forest didn't agree. From the first hour of darkness, I could hear it, soft, deliberate rustling, like footsteps circling my camp, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving in bursts that made me hold my breath. The wind carried whispers I couldn't understand, and every branch cracking beneath invisible weight made me flinch. I didn't sleep much, not really. I tried to convince myself it was raccoons or the wind, but even as I told myself that, I caught glimpses of movement through the shadows, figures ducking behind trees, watching from the ridge, crouched low and still until I looked away. Their presence was not loud. It wasn't like they were chasing me. It was something quieter, older, a patient waiting, like the forest itself had eyes and ears that weren't mine. By midnight, I began noticing signs around the clearing. Small, crude shelters made of branches and scraps of fabric, the earth trampled as if someone, or something, had been living here for some time. My stomach knotted at the thought that I'd stumbled straight into their territory. I stayed awake, knees pulled close, ears straining for any sound. Every snap of a twig made my heart leap. Sometimes I thought I saw a figure close enough to touch, crouched behind a tree, watching. I couldn't tell how many there were, 2, 3, maybe more, but the feeling of being surrounded was suffocating. I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm, to convince myself that if I didn't panic, nothing would happen. But the rustling didn't stop, not once. Shadows shifted around me, sometimes stopping at the edges of my firelight. The occasional howl of a distant coyote sounded almost human in that hollow, and I couldn't tell if it was warning me or laughing at me. At some point, I realized the truth. I wasn't just being observed, I was being hunted. Not in the sense of someone wanting to kill me outright, but like prey being watched for weakness, being tested for how I would react. My mind raced through every decision I'd made, every turn in the road that had led me deeper into this place. I tried to stay still, keep my breathing quiet, focus on the fire, but even that small circle of light couldn't hold back the sense of being surrounded. The forest felt alive, patient, waiting for me to slip up, to make a noise, to expose myself. Hours crawled past. I counted the minutes by the way the fire flickered, by the rhythm of the unseen footsteps circling, by the way the wind shifted and carried faint, human-like sighs. At some point, exhaustion started to weigh on me, but sleep was impossible. Every muscle was tense, ready to jump, and every shadow seemed to twitch with intention. I thought about trying to drive back, but the road had changed in my memory. It was no longer just a road, it was a gauntlet, twisting, endless, filled with shapes that vanished when I turned my head. By the first hint of dawn, I was shaking uncontrollably, feeling hollowed out from hours of fear and tension. The figures were still there, though farther back now, silhouettes in the grey light, watching as I packed up my meager camp. I didn't speak, didn't make a sound, and when I finally climbed into the truck, the engine's growl sounded deafening, almost too loud in the stillness. I drove without stopping, gripping the wheel as the miles dragged on, counting every turn, every landmark, desperate to leave the ridge behind. Even now, weeks later, I can't forget the way they moved, the way they watched, the silence between their steps. I think about the makeshift shelters, the scraps of clothing, the small signs of life that made me realize how long they had been there, hidden, waiting. Sometimes at night I hear rustling outside my own windows, and I feel the same patience, the same quiet observation that clung to me on that ridge. I know it was real, though I can't explain it, and I know the Blue Ridge still holds them, crouched low among the pines, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander into their shadowed territory. Story 2. The Hill That Whispered. I remember the ridge like it was carved into my memory, every tree and stone etched with the tension of that night. I had driven a long stretch of winding back roads, leaves thick on the ground and fog clinging to the hollows, hoping to find a quiet spot to camp before the darkness swallowed the valley entirely. The sky had been bruised with dusk when I finally pulled into a small clearing near the edge of the ridge. It was perfect in its isolation. Trees leaned close around the perimeter, and the faint outline of distant peaks stretched against the fading light. But there was something in the air that made my skin prickle, a feeling I tried and failed to shake off. I set up my small tent and built a fire, the orange flames cutting swaths of warmth and light through the encroaching shadows. At first, the sounds were ordinary, the crackle of wood, the occasional distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, soft enough to be mistaken for a breeze. I froze, listening. It came again, a low murmur that seemed deliberate, a rhythm almost like speech, but in a language I couldn't recognize. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was the wind moving through the branches, that my mind was making sense of nothing. But the whispers didn't stop. Shapes started appearing at the edges of the firelight. At first, I thought I was imagining them, shadows dancing between the trees, but there was a precision in their movement that set them apart from anything natural. They flitted just beyond the glow, hunched or crouched, moving too deliberately, too carefully, and always keeping themselves half hidden. I tried calling out, telling myself that if they were human, they would respond, but there was no answer. Only the whispers continued, ebbing and rising, as if circling me, testing me. When I went to start my car to leave, the engine refused to turn over. I shook the keys, cursed under my breath, and tried again, but the truck was silent. Panic began to settle in, gnawing at my chest. I could feel them then, not just around me, but pressing in. The sense of being observed from multiple angles at once. Breaths, faint and rhythmic, brushed against the edges of the clearing, but every time I flicked my flashlight toward the sound, there was nothing, only the shifting darkness between the trees. Hours passed, though I didn't dare check a watch. I kept the fire low and tried to stay calm, crouched near the edge of the circle of light, ears straining for every sound. Their presence was unnerving, not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it was patient. They didn't charge or call out. They didn't need to. Just being there, waiting, was enough to break the rhythm of my thoughts, to make my skin crawl. Occasionally, I glimpsed a pair of wild eyes reflecting the firelight, only to blink and find them gone, leaving the shadows unnervingly still. Sleep was impossible. Every time my eyelids drooped, I imagined figures pressing closer, their whispered words tickling my ears, indistinct but knowing. I tried humming to myself, keeping a constant low murmur, anything to remind myself I was human, I was still here, but it didn't help. The night stretched endlessly. Every time I thought of making a run for the truck, a twig snapped behind me and I would freeze, my heart hammering, waiting for a shape to reveal itself. Dawn crept over the ridge with a muted grey light, seeping through the fog and treetops, and I finally felt the possibility of movement without terror. I tried the truck again, fumbling with the keys, and this time the engine roared to life, shaking the silence of the hollow. I didn't hesitate. I drove, slow at first, checking the edges of the road for movement, but seeing nothing, not a single figure. Still, the feeling of their presence lingered in the empty spaces between trees, and in my mind, their whispers continued to circle, as if following me along every bend of the ridge. Even after I reached the nearest town, the memory stayed with me. I could hear the echoes of that soft, deliberate murmuring when I closed my eyes at night. Shadows seemed longer, corners darker, and I couldn't shake the certainty that the ridge was still alive with those unseen watchers. I would sometimes drive past it in daylight, rationalizing the forest as nothing more than overgrown trails and old animal paths. Yet a flicker of recognition would freeze me, like my memory was warning me not to return. Weeks later, I told a locale about the ridge, the whispers, the shapes that moved just beyond the firelight, expecting a laugh or a shake of the head. He didn't react like that. He just frowned and said, "Ain't the first time someone's seen 'em up there. You did right getting out when you did." There was no explanation, no comfort in his words, only the uneasy certainty that I had stumbled onto something that had been living there, unseen, for a long time. The forest was not empty. It had watchers, and they remembered who came through. I try to avoid that road now, even in daylight, but the whispers stay with me, faint as the wind through my own house, an echo of that patient, observing presence that refused to be dismissed. The memory of the ridge, of the figures crouched just beyond the firelight, refuses to fade. It lingers in my chest, in the tightness of my shoulders, in the fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye. I know the ridge will always be there, and I know, deep down, that the watchers remain as well, their murmurs carried on the wind, waiting for the next person foolish enough to camp on their hill. Story 3. The Cabin Without Walls. I was following an old logging trail that twisted deep into a hollow I'd never been to before, drawn by the promise of untouched woods and the thrill of isolation. The sun had dropped low behind the ridge, and shadows stretched long across the uneven path, darkening faster than I'd expected. My truck had long been abandoned on a small patch of gravel where the trail widened, and I'd been walking for what felt like hours, branches scraping at my jacket, leaves crunching under my boots. That's when I saw it. A cabin, tucked into the folds of the forest, small and weathered, leaning slightly as if it had grown tired of standing upright. At first glance, it seemed abandoned like so many I'd come across before, a place left to rot and dissolve into the earth. I approached cautiously, the smell hitting me before I even reached the door, a heavy, almost metallic tang beneath the usual scent of damp wood and moss. As I stepped closer, the doorway came into focus, and the first unsettling detail made my stomach twist. Inside, scattered across the dirt floor, were fragments that didn't belong in an empty cabin. Small bones, some chipped and yellowed, a patch of dark, tangled hair tied crudely to a nail in the wall, and primitive carvings etched into the beams above me. Lines and symbols I couldn't recognize ran in spirals and jagged angles, deliberate and exact. like the work of someone who had spent years marking this space for a purpose I didn't understand. I swallowed hard and tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a hermit had taken to strange rituals, living here alone for years. I told myself it was human hands that had done this, that there was a mundane explanation. But even as I reasoned, the air grew thick and heavy, the scent of smoke mingling with the damp earth so strongly I could taste it on the back of my throat. My heart was racing, and yet something drew me closer, as if I were compelled to inspect the carvings more thoroughly. That's when I noticed movement. Out of the corner of my eye, something shifted near the doorway. Too fast, too quiet to be human. My breath caught. I froze behind a beam, trying to keep my presence hidden, my hands pressed against rough wood. The shadow paused for a moment, and I could have sworn I saw the shape of someone crouched, hunched over, listening or waiting. The quiet was absolute, aside from the soft scuffle of something scraping against the wall. Then came the murmuring, low and guttural, in a language I could not understand. Harsh syllables muttered like a chant under the shape's breath. I dared not move, dared not even blink, hoping that remaining still would make me invisible. The cabin near seemed to shrink around me, its walls pressing inward, the air damp and choking. Each scraping sound made me flinch, each whispered syllable grating against the edge of my sanity. I thought about running, but the doorway was only a few feet away, and to move meant giving myself away. My mind raced, calculating, debating the least dangerous course of action, but nothing felt safe. Then, a slight breeze, or something else, swept through the opening, brushing against my neck and carrying with it a low, almost satisfied sigh. I knew, without doubt, that I was being watched, studied, judged. When I finally bolted, I didn't look back. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, scrambling over roots and fallen branches clawing at my face and arms, the hollow itself seeming to stretch and twist to keep me inside its grasp. The trees leaned closer, their shadows long and unyielding, and I stumbled more than once, catching myself on gnarled roots, driven purely by the terror of being followed. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made my heart leap, and I imagined the shape of that figure crouched at the cabin doorway, murmuring to itself as it observed me, unseen but very present. I didn't stop running until the first faint light of dawn filtered through the ridge, and even then, I kept moving, my body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. When I looked back, the cabin was gone. Or maybe it had always been hidden by the contours of the hollow. Nothing remained but the suggestion of a clearing and the memory of that oppressive, suffocating presence. I could still feel it, even hours later, a weight pressing on my chest. A reminder that whatever had lived there had not wanted to be disturbed and might still be waiting just beyond the line of sight. Even now, thinking back, I can't separate the memory from the feeling. The hollow itself seems alive in my mind, shifting subtly, twisting paths, shadows clinging where they shouldn't. I still hear the faint echo of scraping and murmuring when I close my eyes at night, a whisper from the past that feels urgent, accusing, patient, and sometimes when I pass other abandoned cabins deep in the Blue Ridge, I can't shake the thought that some of them aren't empty, that the forest still holds its secrets tightly, its watchers crouched just beyond the door, waiting for someone foolish enough to cross their threshold again. Story 4. Faces in the Creek. I remember that creek more vividly than any other place I've been, though I wish I could forget it. It was a quiet stretch, tucked into a hollow between two ridges, the water clear and shallow, tumbling over smooth rocks in a steady rhythm. I had been fishing there for years, alone most of the time, drawn by the peace of the water and the isolation from any roads or houses. That afternoon, the forest was unusually still. The kind of silence that makes every snapping twig and falling leaf sound louder than it should. I was standing ankle deep in the creek, casting my line, when I noticed them. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other small animal, but the eyes didn't match anything natural. They were too low, almost at the waterline, and they glinted in the sunlight in a way that made my stomach knot. I froze, scanning the brush along the bank, but there was nothing else in sight. No movement, no sound except the water. Then I saw it. A figure emerging from the creek itself. Mud coated its body, and the hair was plastered to a gaunt face, streaked with earth and grime. It just stood there, staring, and I could feel the weight of its gaze as sharply as if someone had pressed their hand to my shoulder. Its eyes were wild, unblinking, and it didn't flinch when I moved. Then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound, leaving only ripples in the water and the sharp smell of damp earth behind. I tried to convince myself it was a local kid or some other camper, but there had been no campsites, no tracks, nothing that suggested a human had been there. That first sighting stayed with me, a nagging unease that settled in my chest and refused to leave. In the days that followed, I returned to the creek, hoping it had been a fluke, something my eyes had played tricks on, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sometimes I'd glance up from the water and see movement just at the edge of the tree line, a fleeting shadow, a pair of eyes reflecting sunlight, or a face barely glimpsed behind a tangle of branches. They never approached openly. I never saw more than glimpses, and yet their presence was constant. From the rocks along the bank, from trees leaning over the water, even in the reflections on the surface, I could sense them. I remember one afternoon leaning on a boulder mid-creek, trying to shake the tension and catching my own reflection in a pool of still water. And for a second, I thought I saw two other faces staring back with mine, distorted by ripples. My heart skipped, and when I blinked, they were gone. The forest itself seemed alive with their vigilance. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves felt deliberate, like they were moving just out of sight to test me, to remind me I was never alone. Birds would suddenly fall silent as I entered certain stretches. The wind would pause as if holding its breath, and I began to dread the days, anticipating the moment when those eyes would appear again. My fishing trips, once peaceful, became exercises in endurance. I'd watch the banks, the rocks, the water, every shadow, until the light faded, forcing me to retreat before I lost myself to the fear. I tried telling people about it, about the figure in the creek and the constant watching, expecting a laugh, a shake of the head, anything to make me feel sane, but no one could relate. I even returned to the spot with friends once, but the forest seemed empty then, almost polite, hiding itself. That only made the memory worse because I knew the watchers didn't need to appear constantly. They only needed to exist to remind me they were there. Sometimes, months later, I'd walk near a stream or a pond, and the feeling would rush back. The low, watchful eyes, the sudden chill in the air, the forest holding its breath. On one occasion, I saw something cross the creek at night, just barely visible under the moonlight. I had been returning from a late hike and thought I was alone. A splash, and a dark figure covered in mud moved like a shadow sliding across the rocks. Its gaze caught mine for an instant, and I swear it recognized me, or at least knew I remembered it. Then it disappeared into the tree line, leaving only the soft lapping of water and the smell of wet earth behind. That night, I slept in my car instead of my tent, the memory of those eyes fixed in my mind, haunting the edges of sleep. Over time, I noticed patterns. The watchers never made a sound, and they never approached directly, but they followed movements, studied behaviors, and seemed to know when I was alone. I could feel it in the brush behind me, in the pressure of unseen presence from the opposite bank, in the way the forest changed subtly when I returned. The creek itself became a place of tension, a living entity filled with quiet judgment, and even now, years later, I avoid it entirely. When I think of it, the memory returns as a weight on my chest, a shiver that won't go away. I've come to accept that I don't need to see them to know they're still there. The forest, the creek, the way the shadows linger just a fraction too long. These are all signs. Every reflective surface, every stretch of water in the backwoods carries a possibility of that same gaze, watching, waiting, reminding me of the horror and the figure that emerged from the mud that first day. I will never know who or what they are, and I don't think I want to. The memory itself is enough to keep me careful, to keep me on the edge of fear, and to make me understand that some places in the Blue Ridge are not meant to be at peace with humans. That creek is still out there, still flowing through the hollow, and somewhere along its banks, eyes are watching, patient and unyielding, just beyond the reach of sight. Me ritual I could not understand. All of it lingers as a weight in my memory. I will never know what they were or why I was allowed to leave, only that their presence exists in the gaps of vision and the spaces between heartbeats, reminding me that the holler keeps its secrets closely, and that some nights the flames burn just for you, to remind you of the quiet, deliberate observation that never truly ends. Story 5, Footsteps on the Ridge. I woke in my tent to the faintest sound of movement, soft steps pressing into the dirt around my campsite. At first, I told myself it was raccoons or some other animal, rustling in the underbrush, pawing at leaves looking for scraps, but the rhythm didn't match anything natural. Each step was measured, deliberate, heavy with a weight that made my chest tighten. I held my breath, straining to hear over the wind and the whisper of pines, and the footsteps continued, circling closer and closer, a subtle pattern that set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my flashlight, careful not to make a sound, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness in a thin, wavering line, illuminating swaying branches and patches of dirt, but there was nothing concrete to see. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement, fleeting shapes darting between the trees, crouched low, careful to avoid the light. They moved in ways that were almost human, yet not quite. Their posture was wrong, jerky, and their presence felt alien, like something that had learned to mimic but never truly belonged. I froze, listening as the soft thud of bare feet continued its circuit around my tent, the rhythm unbroken, persistent, patient. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the play of shadows, or some forest creature I hadn't seen before. I whispered to myself, coaxing calm, willing my mind to focus on the rational. But the footsteps were insistent, pressing against the edges of sleep and sanity alike. Every scrape of a branch, every subtle shift in the shadows made my pulse spike. I could almost feel eyes on me, hidden just beyond the cone of my flashlight, watching, calculating, waiting. I didn't dare leave the tent or make a sound, and yet I knew they were close, circling, testing me, ensuring I was aware of their presence. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The night refused to move forward, as if the ridge itself had slowed its rotation to keep me trapped in that moment. I dared not close my eyes, even for a second, and the flashlight became both shield and curse, illuminating nothing while confirming the emptiness around me that wasn't really empty. At some point, I realized the footsteps weren't random. They were moving in a deliberate circuit, a rhythm meant to unnerve, and it worked. My limbs ached from tension, my jaw was stiff from holding it tight, and my ears ached from straining for a sound that would never reveal itself. Dawn arrived slowly, grey and cold, and I finally dared to step outside. The ground was wet with dew, and the first birds began their hesitant calls. My flashlight lay beside the tent, and I shined it along the perimeter of the clearing, half expecting to see movement, half hoping I wouldn't. That's when I saw them, shallow prints pressed into the dirt, barefoot and human in shape, yet impossibly light. They led from tree to tree, weaving in a careful, deliberate pattern around. The campsite stopping abruptly at the base of my tent. There were no footprints leading away, no trail back into the forest, just the quiet imprint of presence. I knelt, tracing the edges with my fingers, the chill of the earth seeping through my skin, and I felt the oppressive weight of their watch. I could sense somehow that I hadn't been discovered by accident. They had known I was there. They had circled, and now they had left a silent reminder that they had been close enough to touch me if they had wanted. I didn't speak. I didn't move more than necessary. The forest was still, yet every tree, every shadow seemed to hum with a quiet vigilance. I packed up quickly, not wanting to linger another second. The ridge, so quiet in the morning light, seemed different somehow, oppressive in its silence, the weight of those unseen observers pressing down. I didn't stop walking until the first glimpse of the main trail appeared, the one that would lead me out of the holler and back toward the roads I knew. Even as I drove away, I could feel it, the lingering gaze, the quiet patience of those that had walked the perimeter of my tent in the night. Weeks later, I found myself back in the region, retracing the trail out of morbid curiosity, hoping to rationalize what had happened. But the ridge had changed, or perhaps it had never been the same at all. The trees seemed to lean closer, the shadows hung differently, and that sense of being observed returned the moment I stepped onto the path. I never saw them again, not physically, but every snap of a twig, every hollow gust of wind reminded me that some presence had marked me, had left its imprint and was still patient, still waiting somewhere along that ridge. Even now, I avoid camping there, avoid the quiet hollows that once seemed innocent. Yet, when the wind shifts at night, or I pass under dark trees, I think of those footsteps circling my tent, light on the earth but heavy in memory. I can still feel the pressure of unseen eyes, the quiet judgment of something ancient, patient, and unyielding. It was enough to make me understand that some places in the Blue Ridge hold watchers that don't need to appear openly. Their purpose is simple: to observe, to remain, to mark those who wander too close. And in that knowledge, I carry a lingering unease, a shadowed memory I cannot shake, the sense that on that ridge I was never truly alone. Story 6. The Hollow That Laughed. The hollow had been swallowed in fog when I first noticed it, a low-lying stretch of road winding through the Blue Ridge like a ribbon of grey. I was driving slowly, hoping to catch the last light of day slipping behind the ridges when a sound reached me through the mist. Laughter, faint and broken, echoing in bursts that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. I slowed instinctively, trying to peer into the haze, my headlights barely cutting through the grey curtain. At first, I told myself it was a trick of the fog, or perhaps a stream further down the hollow reflecting some sound I couldn't place. But then I saw movement, figures crouched along the roots of trees and the outcropping of rocks, half-seen shapes that blended into the fog, yet moved with an uncanny purpose. Their forms were low, their bodies twisted in ways that made them seem almost animal, yet they were unmistakably human in shape. I froze in my seat, heart hammering, my hands gripping the wheel as the laughter came again, closer this time, more distinct, carrying a sharp edge that made my stomach turn. It wasn't jovial or friendly, it was knowing, deliberate, as if mocking my presence, testing my courage, and reminding me that I was intruding into their space. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, telling myself it was maybe teenagers playing a prank, or hikers with a sense of humor. But there were no trails, no campsites, no evidence of human passage along this isolated stretch. The fog made everything look surreal, yet the movements were precise. The figures shifted from one route to another, crouched low, and their eyes caught the light of my headlights in flashes, reflecting in a way that was unnerving, almost predatory. Each laugh shattered the calm of the hollow, ricocheting off unseen rocks, making the mist seem alive, like it was carrying their voices toward me intentionally. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, the blood hammering against my temples, as though my own heartbeat had been amplified by the fog. I wanted to leave slowly, quietly, but I felt pinned, as if looking away or attempting to drive past would provoke them somehow. Then, without warning, one of the figures shifted abruptly, moving along a rock with an agility that made my stomach clench. Its limbs bent at strange angles, and its head swiveled in a way that was disconcerting, tracking me even as I sat frozen. The laughter came again, louder, jagged, a sound that belonged more to the forest than to any person, and my breath caught in my throat. I floored the gas pedal, the tires spitting gravel and mist as the car skidded along the narrow road. The fog seemed to cling to the edges of the vehicle, curling around the headlights and masking the hollow in ghostly grey. I dared not look back, though every instinct urged me to catch another glimpse of those crouched watchers. Still, I could feel it in the air, the weight of unseen eyes, the sense that they were following, pacing, waiting. The laughter did not return immediately, but in its absence, the hollow pressed against me, silent and patient, like the pause before a storm. Minutes stretched like hours. The hollow finally began to curve away from the ridge, and the fog thinned slightly, revealing more of the forest ahead. Even as the mist receded, though, I could not shake the feeling that the laughter lingered, carried on the remaining dampness in the air, following me beyond sight. I tried to convince myself it was only my imagination, that the isolation and greyness had distorted everything, but the memory of those shapes crouched on roots and rocks, eyes glinting in the shadows, refuses to leave. I've driven that stretch of road many times since, during daylight and when the fog is thin, hoping to see nothing, hoping to erase the memory. But I have learned to trust that hollow, to respect it. Even when empty, it carries the weight of its watchers. I can still feel it in the car, in the shallow vibrations of the tires on the pavement, a prickling along my neck and shoulders. And sometimes, on mornings when the fog creeps low, I swear I hear that same fragmented, deliberate laughter echoing from nowhere, carried across the hollow like a reminder. It is not like the laughter of people enjoying themselves, nor like the startled calls of animals. It is precise, knowing, almost rehearsed. Every time I recall that night, I feel the tension return, the sudden halt of my breath, the way my body tensed, the oppressive sense of being observed by something both human and impossibly wild. The fog has a weight that I cannot describe, a thickness that traps sound, holds presence, and amplifies every small noise until it is unbearable. That hollow became a place where my instincts, my eyes and my mind all screamed at once, "Get out, leave now, do not look back." Even now, months later, I avoid that curve in the road whenever I drive through the Blue Ridge. And yet, when fog hangs low in the mornings, I feel a pull toward it, a memory of crouched figures and laughter that will not fade. I can picture them perfectly. Low, twisted bodies balanced on roots and rocks, their eyes catching light just for a moment before disappearing back into grey. I feel the hollow in my chest, the lingering echo of the sound, the understanding that some places hold their own guardians, patient, wild, watching from just beyond the line of sight. I never returned to that hollow at night. I never needed to. The memory is enough to haunt me, enough to make me cautious, to make me drive faster and keep my eyes fixed straight ahead whenever the fog thickens along the ridges. That laughter has stayed with me in the quiet hours, carried on the damp air of the mountains, reminding me that the hollow is not empty, that it watches, and that some things, some presences, cannot be confronted or understood, only respected and avoided. Story 7. The Road That Swallowed Sound. I set out that morning on a service road that wound through the upper ridges of the Blue Ridge, the kind of gravel path that hikers rarely use and maintenance crews often forget. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, and the sun had begun its slow climb over the ridge, streaking the road with light and shadow. At first, everything seemed normal. The distant calls of birds, the crunch of my boots on gravel, the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. But as I rounded a bend and moved into a stretch of thicker forest, a strange sensation crept over me. The sound around me began to dim, fading in an almost imperceptible way, like the world itself was swallowing it. By the time I reached a small clearing near an old switchback, the sound had vanished entirely. My own footsteps on the gravel were gone, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. The wind no longer stirred the branches, and even the usual chorus of birds seemed to have paused, as if holding its breath. I stopped, my heart hammering, and tried calling out, my voice barely making a sound that I could recognize as my own. That's when I saw them, pale, ragged shapes moving just along the edge of the trees, partially obscured by the trunks, almost blending into the mist that had begun to gather. Their eyes darted rapidly, unnaturally, following me, reflecting the dim light in ways that made my skin crawl. They didn't approach directly, but mirrored my steps, staying just beyond reach, shifting with the forest around me. Every time I tried to veer off the road or take a side trail, the same shapes would be there, keeping pace without breaking the rhythm of their observation. Panic started to claw at me, sharp and unrelenting, as I realized I wasn't just being followed, I was being contained. Every turn, every attempt at finding an escape seemed to loop me back toward the same stretch of trees, the same pale watchers. The ridge, which had felt familiar in the morning light, had become a labyrinth, warped and untrustworthy, and I couldn't tell if I was walking in circles or if the forest itself had shifted to trap me. My breathing grew ragged as I tried to reason through it. I told myself they were probably some vagrant, a local who had learned to avoid people and survive here. But the shapes didn't move like humans, not entirely. They slipped between trees with a jerky, deliberate grace that made them look both familiar and alien. Their presence was heavy, pressing against my chest, filling the silence with a tension I could not shake. I slowed, hoping that maybe if I froze, they would retreat. But the moment I paused, they adjusted as well, continuing to mirror me, ensuring that I felt the unbroken weight of their observation. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I tried every path, every turn, every possible detour, only to find myself again on that same section of road, the same stretch of forest where the pale shapes lingered. The silence around me intensified, each breath of mine loud, intrusive, impossible to ignore. I tried speaking, calling for help, my voice trembling, yet the sound seemed to vanish almost instantly, absorbed by the hollow that had swallowed all else. It was as if the forest itself had become aware, and these figures, whatever they were its guardians, keeping me contained, watching, patient and deliberate. Finally, I forced myself to keep moving, focusing only on the road beneath my boots, ignoring the peripheral flickers of movement. My heart threatened to burst in my chest, sweat stinging my eyes, legs trembling from both fear and exhaustion. But no matter how fast I walked, how carefully I tried to remain calm, the shapes stayed just out of reach, moving in tandem, always matching my pace. Every instinct screamed to run, but even as I considered sprinting, the rational part of my mind recognized the futility. Their speed and agility seemed unnatural, the kind that could keep perfect rhythm with mine without effort. Eventually, the sunlight shifted, breaking through the canopy more fully, and I felt the first hint of relief. The shapes receded slightly, melting back into the trees, though their presence remained palpable, like a pressure in the air that refused to lift. My limbs were trembling, my chest heaving, and I stumbled off the road briefly, forcing myself into a small clearing where I could rest, even if only for a few moments. But the memory of those eyes, those darting, calculated eyes, clung to me more tightly than fatigue or fear. By the time I made it back to a section of the trail where the forest opened to the distant ridge, the shapes were gone, or at least they were out of sight. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't dare. My mind was reeling, struggling to reconcile what I had experienced with reality, but the memory had already cemented itself, a gnawing certainty that some stretches of the Blue Ridge hold watchers who exist just beyond perception. I could still feel their gaze pressing into my chest, lingering even after they vanished, as though the forest itself retained their vigilance. I've avoided that road ever since. Even in daylight, when the forest seems ordinary and the trail familiar, I can't shake the sense of being observed. The memory of the silence, the mirroring shapes, and the relentless pressure of their unseen eyes remains, echoing through every quiet hollow I pass. I've come to understand that some paths are not meant to be traversed, that certain ridges and hollows keep their secrets through patient guardians, and that in the Blue Ridge, being alone can be a deception. The watchers don't need to approach openly. They only need to exist, and the memory of them is enough to ensure that I never return. Story 8. The Overlook of Empty Eyes. I had been hiking along a narrow trail that wound up to one of the higher overlooks in the Blue Ridge, the kind of place photographers love for the sweeping views of the valley below. The sun had begun its descent, streaking the sky with muted gold and soft violet, and the air carried that crisp tang of approaching evening. I paused at the edge, careful to set my pack down without sending rocks tumbling over the cliff, and lifted my camera, framing the valley through the lens. That's when I noticed them. At first, I thought they were tree stumps or rocks oddly shaped by erosion, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were figures, crouched along the cliffs on the opposite side, each one frozen, still, and impossibly deliberate. Their eyes, blank and unblinking, stared directly at me, emotionless, as if measuring me like some specimen. I held my breath, not wanting to make sudden movements, and tried to raise the camera slowly, hoping to capture the moment. But when the lens focused on them, they did not flinch. They did not move in panic or fear. They simply scattered, slipping into the forest silently, with an unnatural swiftness that made my stomach tighten. Leaves barely rustled beneath their feet. Twigs did not snap, and the air seemed to swallow their passage. I stepped cautiously toward the trail that led in their direction, my boots pressing into damp soil, and began to follow the line where they had disappeared. The terrain quickly grew treacherous, steep and uneven, twisted roots and slick rocks making every step precarious. No matter which path I took, the forest seemed to bend back on itself, leading me repeatedly to the same overlook where I had first seen them. And each time I returned, new figures had appeared along the tree line or crouched atop the cliffs, their empty eyes fixed on me, watching silently, unrelenting. Panic began to curl in my chest, a cold, twisting weight that made each heartbeat feel exaggerated, loud against the oppressive silence of the woods. I tried to rationalize wildlife, locals playing tricks, shadows in the dying light, but nothing matched what I was seeing. I called out once, my voice cracking, echoing across the valley in a hollow that seemed to swallow sound. Nothing answered. The figures did not scatter or react. They simply remained, still as statues, eyes following me, waiting. The more I moved, the more the overlook seemed to manipulate itself, the trees and undergrowth rearranging subtly, guiding me back to the point of observation. It felt deliberate, like the forest itself had been shaped to contain me, to ensure I could not escape without acknowledgement of their presence. Every time I tried to climb down a ridge or cut through a side trail, I ended up again at the overlook, surrounded by new faces, new eyes, each pair fixed on me with that same blank intensity. Hours must have passed, though time became meaningless in that recursive loop. Shadows lengthened, and the wind that had stirred earlier seemed to vanish entirely, leaving a heavy, stagnant stillness that pressed against my lungs. I became aware of every sound I had not made, the faint drip of water somewhere distant, the rustle of leaves where there was no wind, and every sound of my own movement became exaggerated, intruding, impossible to ignore. I kept my gaze fixed, trying to memorize patterns, trying to find a break in whatever control this place had over me, but the eyes never wavered. At one point, I thought I caught movement within the canopy, figures perched among the trees themselves, leaning forward to peer at me through branches like something observing a science experiment. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, they were still there, as if they had never left, each new glance revealing more than I had noticed before. Small shapes that crouched just beyond perception, all waiting, all silent. My camera had long since slipped from my grasp, forgotten in the panic gripping my body, and I could no longer separate reality from the memory my mind insisted on holding. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to retreat, my boots carrying me back along the trail I thought I knew. The figures did not pursue me in any conventional sense, but their presence remained, a weight pressing against my chest, a constant vigilance that I could not outrun. Even when I reached the forest's edge and could see the faint glimmer of road signs and distant lights of town, I felt it lingering, an oppressive pressure of unseen observation. I would not have looked back, but the memory of blank eyes perched along cliffs remained etched in my mind, impossible to dismiss. Since that day, I have avoided the overlook entirely, steering clear of trails that lead into that hollowed ridge. Even in town, when the wind shifts or clouds obscure the sun, I feel the same sense of being measured, of being watched by eyes that are not human and yet are familiar in a way that sets my teeth on edge. I have told friends, tried to rationalize it, but the story falls flat in daylight conversation. Words cannot capture the weight, the patient stillness, the unnerving precision of those figures. It is not just the vision, it is the feeling, the memory of being contained within a forest that can shape itself, can manipulate paths, and can place watchers in every conceivable vantage, ensuring you never truly escape their observation. Even now, months later, I see them in fleeting reflections, in shadows along ridges I pass by, and I feel the hollowness in my chest that accompanies that knowledge. The certainty that I was never simply alone at that overlook, that those blank eyes remain, patient, deliberate, waiting for the next wanderer who might step too close. And in that memory, I feel a sorrowful understanding. Some places exist not for us, but for them, for their observation, and the weight of their study will remain long after we leave. Story 9. Lanterns in the dark hollow. The trail had narrowed by the time I realized the sun was gone, swallowed behind the ridges, leaving only the dim afterglow brushing the trees in a weak amber light. I had been hiking longer than I planned, my boots crunching over leaves and twigs, my breath forming small clouds in the cool evening air. That's when I noticed it. Faint lantern lights flickering down the hollow, tiny glows like fireflies clustered together. Curiosity gnawed at me, the kind that sometimes gets you into trouble in the mountains, but I convinced myself I could just observe, maybe get a better view of someone camping or hunting in these remote woods. As I drew closer, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches, the shapes of figures became visible. They were crouched near small fires, their faces partially obscured by shadow, bent over something I couldn't make out. Their movements were deliberate, quiet, almost hypnotic, the way they worked around the flames as if performing a task that had been practiced 1,000 times. I froze, uncertain whether to step closer or retreat. A strange, heavy smell hung in the air. Smoke mingled with the damp earth of the hollow, sharp and clinging, pressing against my lungs. I realized I wasn't just witnessing people but being watched. Then, one of them lifted its head, or at least it seemed so, and our eyes met in the firelight. The lanterns went out instantly, plunging the hollow into a darkness so thick it felt solid, as if I could reach out and touch it. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face, couldn't hear anything beyond the thundering of my heartbeat. Panic rose like bile in my throat, and I bolted, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches tearing at my sleeves and hair. Every step felt like running through a trap, and the smell of smoke, of damp earth and burning pine clung to me, following, pressing, almost predatory in its persistence. I couldn't tell how long I ran, only that my legs burned and my lungs screamed. The hollow seemed to shift with me, narrowing, twisting, conspiring to keep me within its grasp. Every time I thought I might break free, a tree trunk would appear just ahead, a slope would drop too sharply, or I would hear a soft crunch behind me that might have been my imagination, or might have been them. I dared not look back, but I felt their presence, patient and deliberate, moving in the shadows, echoing in the silence left behind by the vanished lanterns. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing, a spot where the forest thinned and the moonlight filtered weakly through the branches. I collapsed against a boulder, chest heaving, sweat stinging my eyes, and tried to make sense of what I had seen. There were no footprints near the fires, no sign of a path leading away, as if the figures had vanished into the very air, leaving the hollow empty and still. Yet the memory of those small flames, their flickering light casting shadows across hunched forms, stayed with me, burned into my mind with a clarity that refused to fade. I waited in the clearing until my pulse slowed enough to stand, moving cautiously toward the trail that led back toward the ridge. The hollow remained silent, unnervingly so, the kind of silence that feels like waiting rather than absence. Every shadow along the trail seemed to quiver, to suggest a figure crouched just beyond perception. The smell of smoke lingered in patches, teasing the memory of the fires, and I realized I could not escape the sensation that I had been observed, measured, catalogued in some unknowable way. By the time I emerged from the hollow entirely, the lights of distant houses and road signs brought a false comfort, but the hollow's memory remained, pressing against my chest in quiet moments, in dark rooms in the half-light before sleep. I have returned to the mountains since then, but never that hollow, never after dusk. And yet, sometimes in dreams, I see those small fires flickering in the darkness, hear the crackle of wood, the faint scuff of movement just beyond vision. I wake with the same tightness in my chest, the same smell of smoke clinging to my memory as if it were a living thing, and I know that part of that hollow, part of whatever waited there, has followed me into the waking world. Even telling the story now, weeks later, my hands tremble and my throat tightens. The fear is not from the physical danger I faced. It was that sense of awareness, of being watched by something that moved with patience and precision, shaping the darkness itself. The hollow, the fires, the figures hunched over so